I had the privilege to present the second and the third chapter. And I will just start by saying that I think that it was a lot of ground to cover, and I tried to shorten it. I basically excluded a lot of examples because there's a lot of diabetes, and in the end I just went along with diabetes. So if you feel like you want to talk about some example that I didn't mention, just bring it up in the discussion. So Comte based his understanding of the pathological on Rousseau, and he credited Rousseau for having declared that all diseases acknowledged as such are only symptoms, and that disturbances of vital functions could not take place without lesions in organs or rather tissues. And from him, he also took up the notion that all diseases consist of an excess or lack of excitation. And Comte also took Rousseau's idea that the laws that govern the pathological state are the same as the laws that govern the normal state, and that the same laws also exist in society. So in terms of his view on the pathological, Comte saw diseases as useful experiments that showed the pathological without the interference of the experimental methods. He thought diseases were slower and more natural, and therefore better than experiments themselves. Following Rousseau, he maintained that the pathological state is not radically different from the physiological state, so much so that the latter could be seen as a simple extension of the former. And consequently, every conception of pathology must be based on prior knowledge of the corresponding normal state, but nevertheless, the scientific study of the pathological cases becomes an indispensable phase in the overall search for the laws of the normal states. Oh, I think I skipped a few. Canguilhem, however, comments that Comte's thesis is too abstract and void of any precise medical examples. For example, why would a sclerotic artery be analogous to a normal one? And how is a systolic heart identical to that of an athlete at the height of his powers? Canguilhem also points out that for Comte, one has to first determine the normal and its true limits before turning to the pathological, without offering any criteria by which we could know what constitutes a normal phenomenon in the first place. The concept of normal is therefore a qualitative, polyvalent, and anesthetic concept, much more than a scientific one. So on the one hand, Comte is trying to deny a qualitative difference between disease and health and a certain homogeneity expressible in quantitative terms. But at the same time, he uses expressions that have a qualitative ring to them, as Canguilhem says. Since this is something that Comte took over from Rousseau, Canguilhem turns to him in the following section. So Rousseau claimed the vital primordial fact was excitation. There are two kinds of excitation: external, which gets transmitted to the central nervous system, and internal, which consists of backward excitation transmitted to the tissues by the central nervous system. And here, two possible deviations can occur. One is brought by deficiency, the other by excess, with the latter being more important in the pathology than the former. The terms pathological and morbid are equated, and a distinction between the normal or physiological and the abnormal or the pathological, a simple quantitative one, defined in terms of deficiency and excess. So Rousseau is, according to Canguilhem, confusing cause and effect. So a cause can vary quantitatively so that it nevertheless both continues and provokes qualitatively different effects. For example, a quantitatively increased excitation can first produce pleasure and then pain. And the bigger issue here is that such a theory mixes 2 points of view together: that of the sick man who is experiencing his illness and who feels a difference, and that of the scientist who finds nothing in disease that cannot be explained by physiology. Canguilhem then adds that Rousseau's position can be further developed in two slightly different directions, depending on whether one stresses homogeneity or continuity. Begin emphasize continuity, but as Canguilhem adds, this position can be compatible with heterogeneity. The continuity of the middle stages does not rule out the diversity of the extremes. And on the other hand, Rousseau and Comte emphasize homogeneity, but their vocabulary shows that excess and deficiency exist in relation to a norm, which is not conceived as a fact, but as an ideal. It shows that they are defining the normal by attaching value to some states, rather than by determining such states via purely quantitative measures. So their project therefore fails because they couldn't define the normal in a purely objective way as a fact, and because the differences between the normal and the pathological states couldn't be expressed in quantitative terms. And in the remainder of this chapter, Canguilhem expands on this further by turning to Vörös' predecessor, Brown, Lynch, and Bichat. And the point of this further elaboration is to show even more extreme versions of quantitative analysis and the history of this terminological confusion. So in the third chapter, Canguilhem starts with a description of Bernard's theoretical position. And for Bernard, medicine was the science of disease and physiology a science of life. The most important is physiology, from which we can understand pathology, which in the end informs therapeutics. So the basis for practical medicine is theoretical knowledge of the physiological. And his most important claim was that pathology and physiology are intermingled and essentially one and the same thing. So according to Bernard, if we are well acquainted with a certain physiological phenomena, then we will also be able to tell in what ways it can become disturbed in its pathological states. This is because, for Bernard, every disease has a corresponding normal function, of which the disease is only the disturbed, exaggerated, diminished, or obliterated function. An example of this is diabetes, which for Bernard consists only of a disturbance of a normal function. And in Bernard's view, all 5 symptoms of diabetes, glycosuria, polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia, and autophagia, are nothing more than an exaggeration of a normal process. And Canguilhem points out here that while this can be proved for 4 of these symptoms, it cannot be proven so easily for glycosuria. And Bernard himself was aware of that, which is why he only assumed that there was such a thing as glucose in the normal urine without actually proving it. Nevertheless, Bernard proved that the sugar we find in the living organism is not just something introduced through feeding, but it is produced by the same organism. He also showed that blood normally contains sugar, and that urinary sugar is a product usually eliminated by the kidneys when the rate of glycemia, glucose in the blood, exceeds a certain threshold. Therefore, according to Bernard, glycosuria is the consequence of glycemia going over a certain threshold, and whereas glycemia is not in itself pathological, in certain quantities it becomes pathological. And Canguilhem explains here that Bernard held this view because he was trying to prove a point against professors who claimed diseases were an expression of an operation completely foreign to life. They claimed diabetes was an extra physiological entity superimposed on the organism. So, whereas his opponent claimed health and disease were 2 opposing principles fighting over the organism, Bernard claimed diseases were nothing more than an exaggeration of normal processes, that in essence, the difference between health and diseases are only differences of degree. And while Bernard's opponents maintained a series of opposition of good and bad forces, of an antagonism between life and death, the living and non-living, Bernard insisted on the continuity of phenomena, their imperceptible gradation and harmony. And this supposed continuity of phenomena enabled Bernard to make some unique progress. He was the first to assert physicochemical identity of plant functions and corresponding animal functions, and he discovered, with the help of some dogs, that the glycogenic function of the liver. So Bernard made these discoveries by claiming the homogeneity of matter in and outside of the living organism at one hand, and the originality of the living organism on the other, which begs the question if he was a materialist or a vitalist. And this question, set in terms of trying to define the concept of health, means that is the concept of health objective and a concept of objective reality, which can be reached with quantitative knowledge, and correspondingly, is the difference of value that the living organism established between his normal and pathological life an illusory appearance, which the scientist has the obligation to deny? And Canguilhem tries to show that in Bernard's thought, there is not a clear answer to these questions because he used qualitative and quantitative expressions interchangeably. He used the term quantitative variation, which referred to homogeneity and which demand that we define a common nature between health and sickness, and differences in degree, which refers to continuity and which enables us an understanding of health and sickness as 2 extremes with a series of intermediate states between them. And then he says that some authors that stress continuity even went as far as to say one cannot define either of the 2 extremes, claiming that there is no perfect health and no completely normal state, which amounts to say that there are only sick men or there are no sick men at all. Here, it would seem that the concept of health is therefore empty, but as Canguilhem points out, this is not the case. Health is defined, and it is defined as a norm, according to which actual health or existing health is to be judged and modified. And then he goes on to say that Bernard, however, does not fit into this understanding, and that is for two reasons. Because for him, the assertion of continuity always implies homogeneity, and because his view of the normal stems from experimental content. And to illustrate Bernard's position, Canguilhem then returns to the problem of diabetes. There he shows that glycosuria can be viewed in two ways. If you look at the renal mechanism in terms of its results, we can see the disease in a form of a new quality. But if you look at the renal mechanism in itself, the disease is only a quantitative variation. So faced with these two options, one would think that the appropriate choice would be the second, since the expression could always be seen just as a derivative from the mechanism. But that would make sense, Canguilhem says, only if we could show that physiological functions can be considered as mechanism, thresholds as barriers, regulations as safety values, and so on. To prove this is not the case, he turns to the modern understanding of glycosuria. So contemporary medicine thinks glycosuria may indicate the presence of diabetes, but it's not diagnostic, nor does the absence of glycosuria exclude diabetes. And it is also no longer thought that glycosuria is only a function of glycemia, or that the kidney simply prevents the filtration of glucose by means of a constant threshold. That is because in individuals with a low renal threshold, glucose may be present in the urine in the absence of hyperglycemia. Such a disease called renal glycosuria is particularly common during the later stages of pregnancy and in some renal tubular disorders. In patients with compromised renal perfusion or function, glycosuria may be absent despite significant hyperglycemia. And because of this, Canguilhem says the functioning of the kidneys cannot be understood solely in analytical and quantitative terms, but as renal behavior. The renal threshold is essentially mobile and its behavior variable, depending on the patient. It also means that one must study the living organism as a whole. In this case, a disease should not be divided into mechanisms that have gone wrong, but as an event involving the whole organism. And this is best illustrated again by examining diabetes. So in normal metabolic processes, the metabolic fate of ingested glucose is determined by interplay of multiple hormones. Insulin is of major importance in this, but glucagon and other hormones are also important and are interactive with insulin, which is also proven by the experiment that he mentions in the book. With insulin, the blood glucose level is increased. With glucagon, with insulin, the blood glucose level is decreased. With glucagon, it is increased. And both of these hormones are produced in the clusters of cells in the pancreas called islands of Langerhans. So if you look at a healthy person, blood glucose level is high after a meal. Since there is an abundance of glucose, some of it is removed from the circulation by the liver, and the rest is transported to muscle and adipose tissues, where it is consumed as a metabolic fuel or stored. And insulin here also inhibits the breaking down of the alternative energy sources, such as fat and protein. And this would be an appropriate response to the abundance of circulating nutrients that occurs after meals. And in a normal person, during fasting, normal, healthy, during fasting, insulin levels are low, these processes are reversed, and stored fuel is made available to all tissues. And this process is completely different once a person gets ill with diabetes. Because there is absence of insulin, which is necessary for glucose to enter cells, the metabolism responds as if it were in a state of fasting. So the mechanism by which it reacts stay the same, but since it's not happening in different circumstances, the same mechanisms only worsen the situation. Despite high level of glucose in the blood, the liver starts converting stored glycogen to glucose. That means it's putting even more of glucose into the bloodstream that's already oversaturated. Meanwhile, body stores of protein and fat are being depleted in the futile synthesis of new glucose that cannot be used efficiently and serves to aggravate the existing hyperglycemia. And this excessive glucose accumulation in the circulation leads to the movement of water out of cells to maintain osmotic balance, causing intracellular dehydration. And ultimately, this leads not only to water loss along with the glucose, but also to excess exertion of potassium, sodium, magnesium, calcium, phosphate in the urine, and to a bunch of other serious problems. So diabetes is therefore not a kidney disease, not a pancreatic disease, nor a pituitary disease. Instead, it's a disease of an organism of all whose functions are changed. So with all this in mind, Canguilhem says that Bernard was not so much wrong as inadequate and incomplete with his descriptions. What he claims is valid only in some cases and in some limited way. That is, as long as a pathological phenomena is limited to some symptom, leaving aside its clinical context, and as long as the symptomatic effects are traced back to the partial functional mechanisms. But even in these cases, Canguilhem says there is still a problem, and that is because in the living organisms, all functions are interdependent and the rhythm coordinated. And renal behavior can only be theoretically divorced from the behavior of the organism functioning as a whole. So you could technically say that glycosuria could be a function of glycemia connected to the glycogenic function of the liver, but only if you completely disregard the circumstances in which this is all happening and to disregard how the same mechanism has a completely different and contrary effects to normal situation. But keep in mind that Bernard was studying diabetes before the discovery of the Langerhans Islands and before the vital experiments that were done on diabetes were made. So he was pretty much in the dark. In fact, the prevailing notion of the day was that glucose is something produced by the plant and only consumed by humans, and that when it enters the body, it is somewhere burned. So Bernard, when he started to study this phenomenon, he literally went into the body and started searching for the place of the burning, which was supposed to be somewhere either in the lymphatic system or somewhere in the lungs. So in the conclusion, Canguilhem summarizes that Bernard formulated the profound need of an era which believed the omnipotence of a technology founded on science. But by recognizing life in health and disease, Bernard forgot that we are still dealing with two qualitative different states. So as much as medicine needs objective pathology, Canguilhem says it must not research it in a way that makes the object itself disappear. An organism's behavior can be in continuity with previous behaviors and still be another behavior. One could therefore say that the pathological can be distinguished as such only at the level of organic totality, and when it concerns man at the level of conscious individual totality, where disease becomes a kind of evil. From this, it also follows that breaking a disease into symptoms is artificial, because what is a symptom without context and background? And when an isolated symptom is termed pathological, it is often forgotten that what makes it so is its inner relation to the totality of the individual behavior. And this also means that pathology can be known as a science of disease only insofar as it receives from clinical practice the notion of disease, whose origin must be sought in the experience men have with the whole of their environment. And this is also connected to the relationship between the physician and the patient, whereas the physician usually adopts the point of view of the objective symptoms because the latter rarely overlap with the subjective morbid system. But here Canguilhem says, just because a patient is wrong and in what and how he is different, it doesn't mean he is also wrong when he says that he feels different, or that the physician is right when he disregards his qualitative different feelings. So this is the end. So now for some discussion topics. I thought about some additional weaknesses of the quantitative approach, because, for example, one could criticize Comte because his conception of health lean more towards health in an ideal desired state than the more scientific existing average state. But the latter is also limiting in the sense that the normal is constrained by two constants, so either too much or too little, which do not have much room for either individual variation or the adaptability of the organism. So this is the first question. And then the second would be, after reading these two chapters, what would you say a normal state is according to Canguilhem? Because as he says, if pathology receives its notion of disease from the patient, what is then the intermediary stage called, whereby a patient doesn't feel sick, but is by objective standards not healthy? How does one reconcile individual variability and the necessary comparative approach when one is demarcating the line between what is still in the realm of normal and what is not? And then the third one is, what did you think of Canguilhem's critique of Bernard? And this is connected to the fact that Canguilhem at one point states that Bernard was not simply wrong, as much as he was partial and incomplete with his descriptions. And here, I guess it's a bit misfortunate that Bernard took diabetes as his prime example, because this is probably the worst example for what he was trying to prove. And on the other hand, he made the same claims for infectious diseases, which I left out as well. And perhaps his way of thinking is more wrong here than it is in the case of diabetes, where he literally did not know anything. So what I'm trying to say is perhaps his theory also reflects the fact that at the time they did not have the extensive and interconnected view of the organism as today. And in the light of this, it makes sense to approach things as they did, by breaking diseases down to symptoms, finding partial mechanisms, and so on, because that's all they could find at that point. So yeah, this is it.
Thanks, Barbara. That was a pretty exhaustive presentation of quite some pages, basically. I think that the original idea was something that was closer to what Isaac intended. So when he included Comte in his presentation, I think that this was how I envisioned it originally as well, because you know, if Comte is not included in the first parts of the book, then what you get is what Barbara got, basically, which is actually quite a lot of ground to cover. So yeah, let's go to the debate. I don't want to start, but I'll try to be a bit of a moderator today, so that we don't diverge as often as we did last time. So any questions or any comments with regards to the presentation?
Well, I would maybe begin by saying that it's fascinating to what extent this is still very much relevant. For example, today in philosophy of psychiatry, the question of whether disease is necessarily harmful is very important. And for example, Thomas Saz, who is probably best known anti-psychiatrist, he essentially follows Comte's line of saying that something can be a disease only if it is accessible to objective scientific knowledge. And the whole problem hasn't been really solved in a satisfactory way. In fact, in the latest edition of the DSM, I think the definition of mental illness includes the phrase that it is sometimes associated with harm. So it's still very much quite a aporetic state in today's philosophy of psychiatry and medicine in general.
But I guess that it wouldn't be if people read Canguilhem, because I get the impression that he approaches this question pretty well, how to understand disease, and Goldstein as well, from this more subjective, normative view, from more subjective viewpoint. Whereas today, I feel like we're still trying to understand, like Canguilhem says, disease from some kind of objective view, like trying to understand why some mechanism which is outside there isn't working. And that's basically the problem. And now I feel like in these new manuals, of the diagnostic manuals, are basically in the conflict between this old view of the mechanism, of the physical mechanism out there, which has to be repaired, and this increasing sense of this increasing subjectivity in the general atmosphere today, I think. So it's hard to bring the two together. How to address, on the one hand, someone who is mechanically sick from some kind of old school view, yet doesn't feel that way. And basically these manuals are struggling to navigate between these two approaches.
Yeah, but how is that an old school view? How is that not still a prevalent or predominant view in general? The mechanistic view. I mean, I know that in general you kind of pointed to the fact that this is the case, but I still find it interesting that, one might refer to this as an old school view, as if there was like a coherent alternative view basically available.
But I was referring to what Adnan was saying, basically, that there are these tendencies in the formation of the diagnostic manuals of where people aren't really sure anymore what constitutes a disease, that it's not enough to notice some kind of mechanic aberrations from some kind of statistical norm, but they're trying to grapple with this phenomenon of someone being sick but not really being sick.
But the problem here is, I think, still that there is a general, let's say, at least an implicit norm of sorts that is present, that you could somehow, ideally, find something like that. For instance, when you have these neurobiological studies of schizophrenia, where you have ongoing meta-studies of which brain centers are damaged, for instance. And then what you get is like a whole plethora of different parts of the brain being damaged, and you don't really get a coherent picture because different studies show different different issues, but they still try to somehow kind of discover the underpinning or underlying anomaly that would be present across all the cases, and that you could somehow say, well, you see, this is the, let's say, a neurobiological Unterschrift, a signature of schizophrenia. So there is this, and the funny thing here, I think that what's even more interesting is that Thomas Suss was basically one of the leading anti-psychiatrists. And if I remember correctly, Adnan, and correct me if I'm wrong here, he also kind of, the way he tries to dismantle psychiatric disease is by claiming or arguing that it is not a well-defined disease. That is to say, it is not a disease that you might find a neurobiological substratum or underpinning for it. So this is what this this is the main reason why psychiatric diseases should not be classified as diseases proper. So even he uses a mechanical definition of illness in order to kind of argue that there is no such a phenomenon as schizophrenia.
Yeah, I think he does allow for the possibility of there being some sort of lesions causing psychiatric symptoms, but then he would claim that it isn't really psychiatry proper that would deal with those. It's true medicine, to put it that way, and everything that is psychiatry proper is really just society kind of attempting to enforce its norms upon, well, presumably sick people.
Yeah, but this is interesting that even someone who is kind of trying to, let's say, defend the mentally ill in a certain sense, even he takes this route. But this can be contrasted to, and then I'll shut up, with Lang, who is another very prominent psychiatrist. I'll write the name down in the chat. He, on the other hand, he basically takes on a very different position, and I'm not sure whether you've covered him as well, Adnan, in the course, but he stems from the existentialist / phenomenological tradition. He was quite the name in the UK back in the days, and then he reverted to the old demon that haunts many intellectuals there, and that's alcohol. So he kind of had a very bad end, but he argues in a different way. He basically argues that if you want to understand mental illness, what you need to do is you need to understand it from a broader perspective. So how a living being is embedded in the world, in its society, in the nature, and that basically you have to, in a certain sense, take on board a Heideggerian or a phenomenological understanding of mental illness. So there is such a thing as mental illness, but it is a rupture in the existential dynamics in a certain sense. So he takes a different route.
I mean, we really didn't cover any of that, and I think that's symptomatic enough. The closest thing we got to that was Christopher McGon, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who developed an interesting Aristotelian notion of disease, or rather a notion of the norms from which disease deviates. So that's pretty much it. Nothing overtly phenomenological at all.
By the way, if anybody would like to give Lang a go, I would recommend his first book, The Divided Self. He is also quite well known for his other book, which is called The Politics of Experience, but I didn't like that one that much. Here he's like he's really you can sense that something has changed in his life, and he became very, very angry at this point. And he has this radical notion where you kind of have that the idea that schizophrenics are in a certain sense thwarted mystics, so mystics who were unable to be mystics because of certain norms in the society that crushes the development of, let's say, different people. Yeah. Anyway, to go back to Canguilhem. Any of the questions that Barbara brought up? So maybe we can touch upon the notion of the idea of health in Canguilhem. So what the standards or criteria are. Barbara, have you had any ideas while reading this, or anybody else?
Really, I think he explains that more towards the end. You know, what happens if you have cancer stage 4 and you're dying, but you don't feel anything, and then the doctor tells you you're dying. What is that, right? I think he mentions that later on. So,
he does, yeah.
But yeah, but I don't remember really how he resolves that, because he criticizes Rousseau in the beginning because he equates the abnormal with the pathological, right? And a person can obviously be normal in terms of his individual normality and be completely abnormal in terms of somebody else. So you have to kind of take into account the individual variation of people, but at the same time you kind of have to compare them to get to what is really the thing that makes people sick, or what is really the deviation. So, but that's probably something he explores on further.
He constantly juxtaposes basically two views of disease and health. The view of the, say, scientist or an expert, and the view of the person who is sick. And from the perspective defended by Bernard and Comte, basically the position of someone who is sick kind of loses its value in almost all respects. And one of the reasons he provides for that is what you said, Barbara. So this idea of you may feel great, but then you have like some sort of an accident, and they do an autopsy and they see that you have stage 4 cancer of the kidneys, and you just haven't had any symptoms, so you're basically sick. And I think this is a really, really interesting way of doing it, because what he will be defending in the long term is that the perspective of the first person that is sick is kind of more fundamental or primordial, that it cannot be discarded. So if you are basically, if you're trying to account for what medicine is doing and how it is embedded in the broader scheme of things, you see that basically the perspective of the person who is sick is ineradicable, because it kind of provides the fundamental types of meaning that are then embedded into the techniques and technologies and theories that are done by different scientists and medical personnel. Does that make sense? Not really. I've written something down somewhere, but I can't find it. Oh.
I think that in the very last chapter of the book, he says that in every theory or therapeutic action, you can hear the echo of the person asking for help, or something like that. If this helps.
Because no, I wanted to say something else. I was looking for something else, but that's a very good point. So his notion or general idea is that even if it is truly the case now that for example, you might have a checkup and they might find something that hasn't really been that hasn't really manifested itself in the form of explicit symptoms. So you might have no pain whatsoever, but they might discover a cancer of the lung or something like that, or something less horrid. His point is that the techniques that are being used by modern medicine to actually be able to identify that and determine these underlying phenomena were developed precisely because there were people who were not feeling well, people who were sick and who asked for help, and then the techniques and technologies and theories developed around that. So what you said is like this echo of the person who is still present there, but still I can find something else. I don't know. I mean, there's so many topics here. Why?
So one thing that I found interesting and reminded me of Goldstein and also Thomas Fuchs, as when he says that to be sick means that a man really lives another life. So as we mentioned, the concept of health a bit earlier, I think you probably define health in a similar way. But the problem is that defining that is significantly trickier than just using statistical averages and the like. And defining sickness, disease, as something that has to do with how an organism copes with its environment. There's an echo of that in contemporary philosophy of psychiatry, which is or philosophy of medicine in general, the relational view of disease. That disease is essentially always relational. An organism can't be sick by itself. It's always a problem of a mismatch between the organism's capabilities and the demands of the environment. But then the problem is, where do we draw the line between a disease in which we sort of attempt to fix the organism and something that's not necessarily pathological, just some kind of a deviation which should be dealt with by adjusting society so as to accept the deviation, to make it less harmful to the individual.
That's an interesting notion, like this, that a disease is a mismatch and that it's relational. For example, what if someone can't breathe? And I mean, if something goes wrong with his body, that I don't know, prevents him from breathing adequately, how is this?
That's exactly the example that was given in a paper that I read on that topic. The point is that that's still essentially relational, because the problem is that the individual can't have the proper relationship with the surrounding air, I suppose. You know, it can't get what it needs from the environment. That's the problem. But the problem of, I think it's called the demarcation problem. The problem of drawing the line between pathology, where we need to fix the individual, and something else, where we need to fix society, is very tricky. And I think particularly today, in some more controversial aspects of medicine, which we, well, hopefully we don't need to get to again, it's really becoming relevant. I think it should be blatantly obvious what is meant here. I mean,
No, what do you mean? I don't.
Well, you know, suppose someone feels that they are, I don't know, that they don't associate with any of the two genders, and that they associate with, say, an animal, a particular animal species. Well, you know, it's a point of contention. Where do you draw the line? Is that a problem with the individual or a problem with society? Should we all be, you know, should that be just a normal, disposition as the others are? I think recently that there's been a tendency to kind of push that line more and more towards changing society rather than the individual.
So that's an interesting idea in general, because having read the book, I know that Canguilhem later on talks about the difference between pathology and anomaly. And anomaly, I forgot how he, maybe Isaac, who I think has read it more recently, will know this. But the way he somehow describes it is, so he terms all these ideas in the context of, he frames them in the context of again, values and normativity in general. And the thing is that with anomaly, the normativity of life is not basically thwarted or diminished. So, for example, you might have an anomaly, which is not necessarily pathological, because it is basically an embodiment of a different norm, which in a slight difference in the external conditions might become normative. So the anomaly is something that does not necessarily produce certain obvious disadvantages for the human being in the specific society, but in specific circumstances. But if circumstances change, it might actually become better than the modes of life that were present before. So that would be an anomaly. Whereas a pathology is something that basically thwarts somehow the optimal development of the human being, or of that specific individual. So I'm not sure that this actually helps, but I think that it could probably be an interesting discussion with regards to this. Like, okay, this is the idea I wouldn't really want to defend myself with regards to this, but one possible take on this would be, from the Canguilhemian perspective, is that once you reach a certain equilibrium between the organisms, or let's say human beings living in a specific social environment, what happens is that after a while, certain let's say certain forms of life that in the past have been proclaimed as either explicitly pathological or merely anomalous may, because of the overall circumstances, start becoming what, more normative. So basically, you know, as if there's like an ongoing dynamic between the organism and its environment, and it's always like the testing of different life forms. And then in this cycle, you might reach a certain point where something which was previously either pathological or maybe just anomalous might start to push in the direction of becoming normative. And it's not sure whether this will happen necessarily, but it's possibly one of the ways to look at this from the Canguilhemian perspective, although this is like a very, I don't know, you know, I forgot the details about the difference between anomaly and pathology.
I just add that it can go the other way as well. For example, we can suppose that some forms of mild sociopathic disorders could have been advantageous at a time when we were busy killing each other. At a time when society was quite a bit less organized, and now it is no longer advantageous. Maybe some mild form is not really, maybe it's anomalous, but any more pronounced form is definitely pathological today.
But the thing is, this is a really cool point made by Canguilhem, I think, where he kind of puts forward this idea that it's really difficult to give any pronouncements with regards to this, because as soon as the conditions change, a certain life form may exert its, you know, its what, it's being better than certain others or whatnot. I don't know. It's just that it's always this, the relational notion that you brought forth is really important, so that it's the environmental context might basically show you that a given life form then becomes more prominent or whatnot.
Then you have to look at the context of the species, because maybe you could have such a development in which certain life forms would become normal, even though that would add on a whole for the species as a whole, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I understand. But here another problem that emerges is this issue or problem with the problem of human, animal, you know, we touched about this. Yeah, we talked about this already, you know, because and this is something that then complexifies the whole picture, because you have technique where you basically are able to kind of, by using technologies, you are able to diversify the norms in which you live. And I would say it's not really something that is completely contingent, something that is like, that is completely open to any type of tackling, to any type of action, but it's still way more open. So you can actively engage in changing certain conditions of possibility that then perhaps allow you something. Now, it is probably a matter of actually doing it to see what happens. So at a certain point where the technical capacities become enable you doing certain stuff, you're probably going to start to do it and then see what happens. And it's really hard to see, you know, what this will lead to. So whether a new dynamic equilibrium establishes itself or not.
Yeah, I think Whitehead mentions that as well in the last chapter of Science in the Modern World. Just read it yesterday. Essentially, the point is that science has created so many opportunities for us to actively change our own environments. And it's also a danger because it seems that scientific progress can sort of become a bit too rapid compared to our societal progress. So even if I don't know what Whitehead calls it, I think he uses the term wisdom. Even if our collective wisdom, he doesn't use the term collective wisdom certainly, but don't remember exactly the word he used. Even if it has advanced in the past, let's say in the past 2 centuries, the point is that science has advanced quite a bit further. So we need even more wisdom to kind of know how to deal with the new opportunities that we have and the new dangers.
Yeah, maybe if we try to steer back towards the chapters, I had a thought about the part where Canguilhem talks about John Brown and Samuel Lynch. I think that's in the second chapter. And it's basically about their attempt to really radically mathematically quantify psychological states, like states of disease. And I think that's a very fascinating early attempt at doing this, which is being kind of reprised today. Because you have, for example, in cognitive science, you have the predictive coding paradigm, which is essentially trying to come up with mathematical equations which explain how cognition supposedly works as some kind of predictive machine. And I think there's that theory of consciousness by Tononi, integrated information theory or something. And they're also trying to come up with these complex systems of mathematical terms, like a conscious system has this or that much phi present in it, and it's conscious relative to how much of this phi property it has, and so on. Anyway, I guess I sort of what you guys think about, is it possible to quantify psychological states in this manner, and ultimately quantify diseases? Can you say that rheumatism, like or arthritis, is like a number of excitability around 60, and another condition is another number? Because I feel like even today we're still sort of trying to do this. There's this mathematical tendency in some parts of science, but can it lead anywhere, or is it just basically a mathematical kind of mysticism? If anyone had any thoughts about that.
Well, since everybody's so shy today, except for Adnan.
I might tell something
Okay.
about this. Well, Bernard's and in general physiologists' aim is to obtain the numerical values of organismic phenomena. So the organism, well, the aim is like the measurability demands a localization of the measured phenomenon. So the organism, however, is much too complex to describe, for us to describe its condition by measuring a parameter on a specific site. For example, at the secretion tube of a certain gland, the secretions, or in general, the active ingredients in the organism, are entrapped in multiple layers of feedback loops. So I would say that ultimately it might be a bit of this mathematical mysticism, as you said.
Yeah, that's a good point. And another point that's really, so the point that you brought up is this problem of complexity. And the problem of complexity traditionally has been deemed as simply a pragmatical problem. But it's not necessarily merely a pragmatical problem. It seems that complex systems actually start behaving at a certain level of complexity in ways that are, and this is something that Canguilhem constantly brings up, but he doesn't really have the theory to kind of back this up, because dynamic complex systems have developed starting in the 60s, and then they got a real spin in the 80s and 90s maybe, or something like that. So, but the main idea is that you actually have difference in quantity producing differences in quality. I think this is a really important notion. This is something that Canguilhem constantly is coming back to. To answer your question, Primož, yes, in a certain sense, you can quantify it, but only against a certain background of implicit knowledge of qualitative changes that you first have to see and kind of grasp, and then you can try to find certain statistical averages in that. But what you've done is you haven't really found an underlying reality. So you haven't found, well, now this is the, these numbers actually show us certain mechanisms that are the true reality. You've basically created models that allow you to do a certain something if you stabilize certain other conditions. But if you want to describe the system as a whole, you basically need these complex models where you have these qualitative shifts in quantitative progressions. I think this is really interesting. This is something that I've found also very, very fascinating.
But isn't this precisely the point of predictive coding?
Yeah, to a certain degree
to generate qualitative models, or other, categories based on purely quantitative data.
I would say that that's definitely the goal, and I would be very glad to comment on that more intelligently once I get a clearer understanding of the theory that you're mentioning. But I think that's the general idea. Now, whether they really manage to do that properly, that's another question, I think.
I have a question that I think, that I find it puzzling. So I feel that individuals have, when they get sick, they usually, their bodies, and they respond in a way that they feel subjectively that they are sick, but also they, for example, get a fever to reduce the sickness. So you can look at them as systems that try to return to a normal state by themselves without medicine. So I think that perhaps, for me, it seems natural to divide illnesses into illnesses that into illnesses to which individuals respond themselves in a way as to diminish them, and there are other illnesses where you don't know that you have them. And I feel that perhaps this is an important difference. It seems, at least to me, that seems intuitive. And I would say that illnesses or pathologies that don't provoke individual responses to return to the normal state are not illnesses.
No,
so
yeah.
I'm not sure if I understood that right, and that would solve the problem of what Adnan mentioned before, like sort of identification with animals and so on. Because, for example, if this wrong identification or any sort of social illness, if individuals that have it don't respond in a way that they want to overcome it, then it's not really an illness. I'm not sure if,
Yeah, it's an interesting point, but one problem is that, for example, schizophrenics that don't have very good insight into their condition, they would also adamantly claim that they're not ill in any way. They would act in a peculiar manner to the rest of us, but they would be completely convinced that it's everyone else that's gone mad, to put it
I understand, but I still think I think that mental illnesses are a great challenge to what I've just said, because often having a mental illness does usually mean that you don't think that you're ill. I think, for example, depression, but isn't I don't know, what if suicide is a No, never mind.
Finish that thought. That seems interesting.
Yeah,
What
let's
if,
go.
Freudian.
what if it is a healthy response to
To an unhealthy society,
what?
to a healthy response to an unhealthy society.
A healthy response to an unhealthy state of being depressed, whatever caused it, you know.
Yeah.
But
I-
usually,
yeah.
and if you're unhappy, you usually want to become happy again. So I mean, depression, I don't know. It just feel that this is a important part, you know, that it's not just the fact that you're ill and then there's medicine, but you have this, sometimes you have the response to fight back and sometimes you don't. And why?
I mean,
Last time, yeah.
The point about suicide being some kind of a solution to the problem you have, I think maybe there are more passionate Freudians among us, but I think it was one of the parts of his death drive theory. The death drive is basically when an organism reaches a certain state where it can no longer find its condition tolerable, and so it tries to return towards a state where it becomes tolerable, which is in its case a state of non-existence. Well, this is in a very abstract psychoanalytic direction.
And what about that? It's normal to die, but every cause seems pathological.
What?
Or in a way, you die because of a disease usually, if something goes wrong. So this body is not in a normal state, it's not healthy, but at the same time, dying is normal. So it seems a weird, to me, it seems a weird.
Okay, this is a really good point. I'm going to read a quote that comes later on in the story, but it's really, really nice that Ula brought it up. I really like this quote. I'm trying to kind of insert it into all the papers that somehow refer to Canguilhem. It's on page 220. We have already seen when we examined Claude Bernard's theory in what precise sense such a proposition can be defended. The laws of physics and chemistry do not vary according to health or disease. But to fail to admit that from a biological point of view, life differentiates between its states means condemning oneself to be even unable to distinguish food from excrement. So the main point behind this is, sure, it's a natural process in the sense that you're not breaking the laws of physics or of chemistry. But from this perspective of a biological being, it's pathological in the sense because you're kind of dying. So if it's normal in the sense of what being statistically, it's, yeah. So from the perspective of someone who is alive, dying is an issue. Now, the question that constantly is popping in my mind, you can find ways to come to terms with this. So what the heck does that mean? I don't know from this perspective.
At one point, he offers this evolutionary explanation, the famous one of the butterflies. So that I don't know, in some city, the black or gray butterflies replaced black ones, or I don't know, or blue ones, something like that, because it got so polluted that it was a better camouflage than the normal pattern they had on the wings. And then he says, I think that it's not only the individual who has to transcend his normativity, but also the population, which has to be kind of flexible, has to have a variation in order to sustain itself, to be able to sustain the environmental perturbations. And what I find here interesting is that if you understand normativity in this populist way, death is somehow, it has to be there, otherwise you lose the normativity, you lose the variation. So I have exactly the same problem with Canguilhem. which of course very like a lot, but this kind of that death in a sense is something very normal. It is a natural end to it is a vital end to normativity. I don't know how to phrase it otherwise.
But yeah, I mean, so is your point that basically what troubles you is that in a certain sense that should be normal, but from the Canguilhemian perspective, it is not, because it is kind of in opposition to life normativity?
At one hand, you could say that the perfect normative subject would be one who always transcends the norms. So one who is never diseased, who can never be killed, right? But on the other hand, such a subject would destroy the population, would destroy the environment as such, so that no other, because it would prevail above anyone else. So the environment that is constituted by other subjects, by other organisms, would stop functioning as an environment that he has to transcend. So there's kind of this, I sense a contradiction here, that it's, yeah.
I mean, but he's not looking for a perfect normative being. He's just trying to understand how to look at pathology.
I think Fabo and Mattia wanted to say something also.
Yeah, Fabo can. I don't have to start.
Okay, Fabo doesn't want to start.
I had some comments, but they are not relevant anymore.
Okay.
Okay, then maybe we can get back to that, Fabo.
Yeah, may I actually go back to what Adnan was talking about, the relational theory of disease? I think
Isaac, before we go back to that, I think that Mattia wanted to say something.
Sorry.
I thought, yeah. I wanted to add to the conversation about the normativity and the organism. I think we could look at death also, or the part of death in in a sense in which Merleau-Ponty constitutes the individual, as in someone who always tries to make himself whole. So even death, or the part of life in which you eventually die, if you can maybe take that as a whole, you always, as a person, you always try to make a whole of what of everything that comes to you. I have to switch to English, wait, just a second. But what I'm trying to say is that I think you can look at normativity in this Merleau-Ponty kind of sense, as something you always have to make anew, like you need to I don't have the words to describe this right now, but I'm trying to say that you can, if you, normativity is not something that should be, I think, considered as fixed, as normative, in a sense that it's not changeable. I think, I don't know, it's not like something
static and predetermined. It's not static and predetermined.
Yes, of course, but I think we already came to this. So just I thought just that this, I don't know how is it called right now, but this Merleau-Ponty thing that we always try to make the whole of ourselves and so on. And I think that essentially even death can come in this same process, or at least I don't have the words. I didn't write it down. I usually write it down too, but I was too
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
If I understand correctly, I think what you're trying to say is that if the basic activity of all life is to create wholes, larger and larger, just new totalities, then interestingly, the only way to create a totality, a whole of one's entire life, is to die.
And I think maybe it's the same. You have to destroy another a whole to create another whole. I think that's the point. Even Merleau-Ponty would argue it. I think you always have to destroy a whole in a process of creating another whole. Or am I wrong? I think I agree with you, Adnan. But again, it's not easy for me to think.
Prabhu is back in the game.
Are we talking about like being dead as our like biggest achievement? Because like when we are still alive, there are still like various dynamic forces struggling or somehow. But when we are dead like as one. Are we there? Or?
Yeah.
I think the problem here is because because pathologies and diseases and illnesses are not something. I mean, we consider them something physiological, something pathological. I think, or I'm making a mistake here, but of course you can talk about death, not coming to terms with death in the sense of Asian philosophies. I think here I'm not going, but I think I really think there's something here that I think it's of real importance, and the thing I'm trying to say is that you can make we can't look at normativity as something only tied to the physiological, to the to the material, to something of kind of a mechanism of something that's degrading, of something that's it's being constructed, or something that's growing and dying, but as something much more, as something that even though it's real and it's normative in this material sense, it's much more real even in this how should I put it, in this sense that you don't just make like your body is trying to make a new normativity, in a sense. If I think we can say this in at least in some kind of in illnesses.
I'm really not sure where you wanted to go.
Are you saying that? Are you referring to Isaac? And are you saying that an individual can come to terms with its death without becoming immortal, because that transcends the physical part of just your body dying, and that in that way you can transcend your environment and whatever without ruining it? So
I think yes, something like that. Yes.
So what did I still didn't get this. So is this like that you can transcend this without dying? That's the point? No, that you die. That's the point.
But
yes, but essentially I just wanted to try to convey the idea of the making of new wholes.
Yeah, okay.
In this.
But how does death fit into this? Like, is what Fabo was saying, or what Adnan were saying, like this achieving a new whole by means of death? Is that the point? Because I don't see it. I mean, the main problem why I don't see it is because if life constitutes wholes, then basically you can talk about a whole or a unity in a certain way, but definitely not in a way that would be meaningful for a living being. You kind of step out of it, and you know, the way you constitute wholes, it's not by arriving at something that would be static. As soon as you get there, there is not only whole, there's no nothing, there's no wholes, there's no parts, there's no, you know, and this dynamism that you try to achieve, and you can probably achieve different, let's say, levels of structuration where you attain different levels of wholes, and maybe that's an interesting story to tell. But I don't see the depth. But I'm not sure, the way I understood you, Mattia, you weren't going in that direction.
No, I'll think about it and then I'll return.
No, because Ula understood you in that way. I didn't understand you in that way.
I understood him as referring to Isaac.
Yes, I was referring to Isaac.
And he talked about the tension between
life, death.
Yeah, but I forgot now all about it because.
Okay, then maybe think about it.
I'll think about it, and if I come to something, and then.
Okay.
I don't know.
Isaac, you wanted to open up something.
Yeah, I think it's a natural progression from where we were. So we were talking about the relational theory of disease. I think that Canguilhem's point would be that, for example, if sorry for the example, but if a patient decided to be a cat, he would kind of limit his way of approaching new situations, right? Humans or even healthy people have this ability to include themselves in new situations, which is which is much harder for, I don't know, people with dementia, who really are tied to a certain particular situation, so they cannot expand their normativity the way they interact with the environment. So they cannot set up new norms, if one wishes to phrase it that way. But here also, I find it's not quite an exit from the. It doesn't really. I mean, the objection still applies that here the demarcation problem is a really big problem, because you should. It's not just that you can apply your normativity to new situations, rather these new situations have to be reachable for you, and they're made reachable by other people, because other people are kind of inclusive, or at least partially inclusive. That's why you can transform your norms into new norms. Really abstract, but I hope you can follow. And in that way, this kind of intersubjective constitution of norms, I think here really one can sense the importance of the normative dimension of death, I would say, because I tried to find a good quote of Levinas, but I didn't manage. Sorry, but his point is actually that the relationship to other people, this kind of really pathic intersubjectivity in the sense of a Merleau-Ponty, is possible only when you kind of encounter the vulnerability or the possibility of another person dying, which is radically different from Heidegger, who thinks that the death is something very individual. For Levinas, it's something intersubjective, it's something that enables you kind of this reflexive interaction of being able to evaluate your own subjectivity. And what I found here really important is that the dimension of care here, and I return to nursing here. Okay, so the dimension of care here is very important, because it's not the situation that is capable of including non-normative people, so to kind of enable them to transform their normativity in order to enter the situation, has to kind of keep in mind that it has to be careful about its relationship to the outside, one could say, in the sense that a mother is careful about her child. She cares for a child, or a nurse cares for a patient, of course. But the essential way of constructing these normative situations, which one is able to transgress, is not something subjective. and this actually ties to what I was speaking about before in Canguilhem, because I think his view is very, at some points, very subjectivist. So it's the individual who is sick that determines if he is sick or not sick. It's not kind of the complex interaction with the changing environment, which has to be able to kind of accommodate his normativity in order for him to even be able to construct new norms, which Canguilhem wants to. Sorry, this was really long, and I hope understand. But yeah,
semi. But one response here would be a very quick one, is even if you take the organism, like the individual organism, as the one that in a certain sense determines whether he or she is sick, this will always happen in a specific context in which that person, like there are specific limits in which that person will do this in a way. So what I'm trying to say is that you already live in a society that has implicit, by creating a stable environment, establish certain implicit norms around you, or the levels in which you will find yourself ill or not ill. And there are very interesting cases later on in the book where Canguilhem provides like these comparative anthropological studies or comparative physiological studies, where, for instance, he mentions that the blood, if I'm not mistaken, I might have been mistaken, but something along those lines, that the blood image in a certain African tribe is such that if a European would have that blood image, he would be mortally sick. But basically because the people there had to kind of get used to living with certain parasites that would be basically completely detrimental for someone coming from Slovenia, for instance, they have a completely new norm, so to speak. So when the person there will kind of proclaim itself sick, it's not like he's the solely responsible in, like he's determining this in some sort of a vacuum. So this intersubjective part that you're mentioning is already there. He even says that something like, I forgot many of these things, but he goes into the question of what is the normal lifespan of a human being? What is the normal lifespan of a human being? And he kind of pushes aside these ideas. There's like a biologically predetermined universal something, and that this is very much related to the specific environment in which you live. And he says that if you observe the statistical differences in societies, you might in a certain sense say that the average length of a human's lifespan is basically reflects how valuable health or life is to that particular society. So you have certain physiological standards in a given society, and these may be conducive to a prolonged lifespan or not. And basically what seems like a very objective thing, for example, your pulse rate or the frequency of your breathing or whatnot, he says that it is always embedded in a specific milieu. And this is partially also in human beings a social milieu, which means that it was technologically also constructed. And in a certain sense, it reflects values of that society. So he even goes to say that something that these physiological averages are basically virtues that are meant to be embodied in a specific society. I find this very interesting, like the idea of having you have a physiological average, but this physiological average can be conceived as average only in a specific context, in a specific milieu, and this milieu has been constituted at one point, And in this regard, it reflects a specific norms and thereby values that you want to embody. So it's not like, you know, this is very individualistic. In a certain sense, it is, but on the other hand, it's not really that individual.
Couldn't you
yeah.
also use the example of schizophrenia to illustrate this? Like, you know, I think we actually discussed this during Goldstein, when you have the African interpretation of schizophrenia, where people see it as a kind of mysticism of being able to access spirits, and the disease of schizophrenia attains completely different meanings in that context, and actually isn't pathological compared to this, I don't know, Western version of schizophrenia, where it's seen as hallucinations, which are basically just seen in this negative sense. And on the other hand, in an African culture, it can kind of mean a vision, being a shaman and so on.
I agree and with your point, Sebastjan, but I think it's very important also to not only include the normative aspect, but the possibility of establishing new norms, which is not independent of the environment being able to follow those norms or to allow the transition. So my point is actually, I mean, the sickle cell anemia, we all know it. The transition to a society where people have this hemoglobin mutation is actually non-inclusive. Either you have it or you don't have it. So you cannot, without medicine in that way, you cannot change your normativity, the way you operate. But in order to do that, you have to have somebody who is going to provide you against what is sickle cell anemia effective? So the medication for this disease, is it malaria? Sorry.
Oh, yes, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, and also if you look at a child, it's not that, I mean, if he progressively establishes new norms, it's not enough that he is this creative individual who is capable of doing that, but rather that he has a flexible environment which cares that it follows his development. And for me, this also relates to the relational concept of disease, because it's not only the relation to the environment, neither it's only the ability to transcend this relation, but actually the possibility of the society being kind of accommodating the fact that at first glance non-normative people can approach the normativity. Of course, this is not a well-developed idea, but yeah. That's what I meant with intersubjectivity of normativity. Not just that its normativity is dependent on intersubjectivity, but the transition to a new plateau of normativity is dependent on that you are given an environment within which this is possible. And this is actually clinic or the healthcare provides this, the medicine, not just the kind of the ability. It's not the ability of the organism to achieve a new normativity, but rather to go to a detour, which is not naturally acceptable to him. And this detour is not constructed by him, because everybody else constructs the environment by which he is able to do a new norm, create a new.
What about someone who doesn't live in a society, or like some hermit? How does he define diseases? If he has no access to this intersubjective dimension, which is sort of supposed to be constituent of it?
He gets a disease that can normally be cured in the normal social context, and he dies of it. That's the way I see it. Like he's incapable of employing a technique because he doesn't have this complex structure which provides the techniques by which he can transcend to a new normativity.
Yeah, okay. So Fabo, you wanted to say something?
No, I just wanted to say that's how we live today. You know, if you have some disease that's like a problem, but not a threat. Just have to take care of it yourself. But I don't know where like the norms established here when you do it on your own. I think just like when you're in pain, you know, only when it comes to extremes, you start to invent things like thinking about reducing the pain and drinking herbal tea or taking a walk, or you know, things you can do. But when this pathology is taken out of the institutional medical context, it becomes much more of a how should I say? I mean, personal thing, right? It's much less embedded in any sort of social context.
But I think that Isaac, the way he's, although I'm not really clear about this, but there are two ways you can talk about, let's say, the social contextuality, so to speak. One is having like people surrounding you, nurses, right, Isaac? Nurses surrounding you in the hospital. That's a joke we love from the last time, because Isaac was kind of constantly referring to the importance of nurses and that this is lacking in Canguilhem, that there's like just a medical expert and then the sick person, and there's no in between, and this in between is really important. But anyway, so intersubjectivity can be understood in this context, like nurses and people, but also in the form of, say, medication that you use and the things that you're used to doing when you get sick. For example, there are certain techniques and technologies that you have acquired and that seem to be normal in a specific society, and you revert to those and you basically do them. And that's, you can look at a certain tablet not only as a specific object, but something that is strongly embedded with different layers of meaning. And these layers of meaning are basically sedimented technologies and theories of what it means to heal something. So take the tablet, and this tablet is basically a very long historical process of sedimentation and of the materialized knowledge of your contemporary medical society. So in this regard, I actually found the question about the hermits very interesting. Why? Because the hermit, and of course you have different types of hermits, but let's say a very religious type of hermit will basically try to really reduce so many segments of these layers of meaning and the frameworks that kind of, and I wonder what happens then, you know, because interesting stuff does happen, and this is something that I'm profoundly interested in myself. You know, what happens when you try to cut out different segments of what seems to be normal and what seems to be required for your functioning, and you basically start to experiment with certain fundamental physiological functions. So, concrete examples. I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but you know, something really interesting starts happening if you're fasting for more than 2 days. Like if you don't eat for more than 2 days, and interesting stuff starts to happen. And then if you deprive yourself of sleep and observe yourself for a prolonged period of time, and you do it in a disciplined fashion, not like because you have to write a seminar paper or something like that, even that then you might get interesting results. But say you do it intentionally, say that you sleep only 2 to 3 hours per day, and then other than that you pray, you meditate or whatnot. Interesting stuff again. So, you know, what I'm trying to say here, you kind of get really deep with regards to the bare structure of life, and you get to know it in a different way than you would if you read about it from, say, a specific. in a specific physiological textbook or whatnot. And what is curious is, you know, how far can you take this, and what exactly does happen with regards to what we're talking about now? I don't really know. I can't put it in a Canguilhemian context, if I'm being quite honest, but I think that it's not a trivial matter. Yeah.
I think this is sort of, yeah, the problem I have with what Isaac is saying is this emphasis on the intersubjective aspect. And I think, yeah, sure, for especially for humans, it's a huge aspect, and it kind of shapes the way we form norms. But like what you just said is an interesting example, like a hermit who's essentially trying to cut away to come to the basics. I think what you do is experience this primordial normativity of life, and I don't think you really need subjectivity for that. I think that's because the normativity, and I think that's sort of accords both with Canguilhem and Goldstein as well as Plessner. Normativity is a basic property of life, and life is much more basic than human societies, and it's this normativity is present everywhere, and as such I don't see the need to really bring society so much into the equation.
I mean,
Yeah, but
hermit children are actually wolf children. That's kind of my point. That in order to understand, the hermit kind of understands normativity. This is controversial, but he kind of understands normativity. But in order to establish a relationship with this true normativity that you mentioned now, I think he has to have a certain notion of it when he was brought up. He had to have. If we take it in Canguilhemian way, this transcending of particular norms, this is very obvious when children grow up. I think it's the best example of this. And for a perfect hermit, he would then have to kind of, one could say, forget being a child at one point, forget how it is to relate to your own normativity, because as a child he related through the parents. Parents told him what was good, what was bad. Of course, he also experimented, but actually parents and society provided a certain milieu in which he was capable of living, in which he did not die. But now if you exclude him and say, okay, he's now a hermit, it's not like this childhood disappeared, right? It's the basic structure of normativity, the intelligible structure of normativity got set up intersubjectively. And of course, you can then go being a hermit. And even then, you're not, at least as I understand it, you cannot be completely a hermit. You have to be dependent. Oh, perhaps this is also possible, but dependent at least in some economic means to the outside world, which provides for you and things like that.
Why should wolf children not be normative? I think wolf children are just as normative. It's just that their norms, the way they achieve normativity, is very different to how other humans do, but that doesn't mean they don't have norms.
But would you say that they can become hermits? Sorry.
Fabo wanted to add something.
Yeah, I'm constantly struggling with understanding with what we mean when we use normativity and norms, and I think it's okay because the whole book's about this. But I think Primož made a great point with which I don't agree, but I will try to make something out of it. That like some norms that are like norms of life that are much more common, that are common to all the living beings and stuff, must be something categorically different from the social norms we might be talking about. Like, and I don't think of social norms as just some elaborated forms of life or like vital norms, but rather certain mechanisms of dealing with these vital norms, maybe suppressing them, or more in this kind of, I guess, Freudian sense. And maybe this is why these talks about norms are so confusing, because it's really not clear to what extent do social norms change or like have effect on the vital one. Did anybody get that?
I mean, I think sort of Plessner is trying to answer that. You have this basic normativity of life, but what is it that happens with humans that this seemingly fundamentally different kind of normativity suddenly emerges? And he connects that to the emergence of like this self-consciousness, self-reflectiveness, which essentially means that we stop perceiving the things we do as natural. Actually, like we're conscious of them, consequently they're not natural, they seem something other than nature. And I think that's sort of the difference between the human norms and the, I mean, the human norms and the basic primordial norms. I don't think they're like objectively really different things. They're probably some kind of a continuum, but to us they seem like something of a different order because of the way our consciousness is structured.
Yeah, but they are, I mean, surely other animals can have some sort of social norms, but I really mean of this, you know, like top-down solutions that come from the government or the world organizations, or, you know, on, you know, these things of how to behave, how much of vaccine to distribute, where these kind of things. This, you know, may be built on some sort of vital norms, but they are, you know, they are against the laws of the. They're supposed to be against to. They're supposed to regulate the laws of the jungle of the vital norms, right?
One way that Canguilhem tackles this is by introducing the concept that I've mentioned before, that is technology or technique. So the main point being that at a certain level, he doesn't really go too deep into this, but the point is, the way he kind of presents it is that by means of technologies and techniques, what happens is that you can more actively modify the environment and milieu you live in. So you kind of get this more, it's not, this is very interesting in Canguilhem. He wouldn't say that you actually that you have a predetermined plan and then you simply apply a specific technique or technology to modify something and achieve something, but it's more like you have the capacity to use tools, or you have the capacity to use certain techniques and develop certain technologies. And as you do that, you kind of tinker with them and you establish certain milieus that are beneficial for this or that. And then after a while, you can systematize that and becomes a stabilized norm. And, you know, this is the one way of how he would go about explaining this difference. And it's a difference again in quantity. If you look at it, you might say, well, you know, the beaver builds dams, and the bees does all kind of interesting stuff, and the spider will build its web. But the thing is that with human technique, what happens is you basically not only can use a tool, but you can use the same tool for different purposes. And what's more, you can build other tools with the tool that you use. So what happens is that you enter into the realm of infinite recursivity, where you can apply tools to tools, to tools, to tools, and the new tool becomes a new tool. And basically, again, what happens is, although there's in a certain sense a quantitative progression, you have a qualitative leap. And with this qualitative leap, you might say that, well, sure, you know, there are natural norms, but once you achieve this state, these natural norms do change in a significant way, because you basically can tinker with the conditions of possibility, you know, and you can tinker with them in very profound ways. And the more technologies you have available, the better you can do this. And by better, I don't mean necessarily better in the sense that you're progressing towards something positive, but you're more efficient with it, which can actually prove detrimental, what Adnan said. And for instance, the exponential explosion of technologies nowadays, nobody really knows what's going to happen, because again, what is important with technologies, I think this is something that needs to be underscored and undermined constantly, is you don't really know the horizons that will open up with a given specific technique. You develop a certain something with a certain aim. And once you develop it, it opens up the possibilities for 20 or 50 or 100 new uses. And these will manifest themselves. And when they manifest themselves, a whole new set of horizons opens up and new technologies are given rise to. So, you know, it's just, I think that this is a really, I think that this would be a Canguilhemian answer to make this, to stop this here, to what Fab was saying, that technologies and techniques are the ones that kind of make a qualitative difference in vital slash social norm.
So you would agree that these qualitative changes that happen can have like a reverse effect back on vital norms?
Yes.
Okay.
But only to a certain degree. I mean, it's one of those aspects where you have a complex system, and then you fill it up with new energy, and it kind of moves, it restructures itself into a new stable form that is on a higher level. And the previous configuration, in a certain sense, is still part of it, in the sense that if something goes wrong, this will come to the fore necessarily. But it's not there in the sense of being a part. You know, it's just the whole was restructured, but the aspects are still there in a certain sense. You know, but they're not there as elements. So the same, my contention would be that the same holds true for the relationship between vital norms and social norms. It's a dynamic transformation in the sense of dynamic systems. The whole changes, and when the whole changes, the individual aspects gain different functions and different meanings. So maybe, you know, analytically you can draw certain correlations, but they are basically different because they operate in different wholes. Put differently, Fabio, you'll still have to breathe, right? And you'll probably also have to eat, you'll have to have sex and things like that, but you're going to do it in a very, very different way. Sometimes in a way that doesn't even that is not even remotely similar to what, for example, somebody might do, you know, some animal might do. You might, for example, the notion of sexual activity can become something that is almost like, in a certain sense, if you just look at it from the material perspective, it doesn't really have any resemblance whatsoever with sexual activity, but it carries the same meaning. So this is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, like certain things can take my breath away, even if there is no natural
yeah,
they would.
Certain things can take your breath. Noise.
I mean, I have this feeling that with this, you said infinite recursivity, like emerges kind of with tools and everything. That just explains what happens. It doesn't really say why it happens. I mean, and I think it was the same problem with Goldstein. He was just like describing things up to a point in this biological sphere, and then there was just this jump, and then he's describing things from that point on, and there's nobody really knows how to marry the two.
No, the thing is, Canguilhem really doesn't say this, but I've read a really, really interesting idea about this, and the fundamental idea is that the thing that allowed this to happen is basically related to human beings becoming bimodal beings. So when you were able to start using your hands, not for locomotion, but you open this up, and then the grip that your hand allows you to do, this is something that is kind of been described. I forgot the details again, but I found this, like, this was the first idea, the first theory that sounded really compelling to me. So becoming bimodal and basically freeing your upper extremities to be used. And once this is used, this can be used as a tool in itself. So basically all the tools that you're using become the extensions originally of the original two tools that you can use for different purposes. So the recursivity lies there. And I know that this is not a perfect explanation, but at least it's a hypothesis that's worth, that's interesting. And it would seem also that this happened before the explosion of the brain. So before the brain of the modern Homo sapiens became as large. So it would seem that this was the catalyst of the brain becoming actually larger. So again, this active behavioral aspect was something that that resulted in the reconstitution of the whole, in a certain sense. I find this at least an interesting idea. So because you have this idea that it was because of the brain. Yeah, well, why did this happen with the brain? You know, it just seems like.
Well, what I'm still curious about is that, okay, this is kind of the condition which enabled for what is the qualitative shift? That's my question. That's what I think. You have a lot of these, even Oschlei's book, for example. He also lists for a bunch of things. Okay, so this was necessary for the specific human's consciousness to emerge, and the other thing was necessary in a lot of things. But the question, which he does answer using Plessner and everything, is what actually happens in the way humans go about their forming of norms. If we go back to a Canguilhemian language, what changes in our normativity with this use of tools? That just these tools are just some kind of a manifestation of this change. That's how I view it.
Somebody else give this a go so that we don't turn this into a dialogue.
I mean, if we think of tools in more broader sense and bring in things like language and things like that, things can get a bit more trickier, and it's harder to say that tools are just like results of certain change, because like if I understood you correctly, thinking of tools as just being like effects of, I don't know, certain circumstances or the desire to, you know, make some food in an elaborate way. But you know, the thing that Sebastjan mentioned, using tools in different ways and taking whole essence of the tool and bringing it to some completely different context. Maybe, you know, something like ontologically more than just a piece of material object like hammer that you can use for this and this and this. I think it can go much broader, but
yeah, but it's even like, okay, Primož, let me give you a few examples that will be like very quick. But you know, you might start building a house so that you live in, but at the same time, the structure of my house tells other people how well off I am, how important I am in a specific society. The way I dress shields me from the elements, but it also attracts, it also repels, it can scare, it can even exhibit that you don't want to mess with me because I have all the tools available to really hurt you. And it's just by using what? Look, it's a piece of cloth. If you think about it, are these not values? Are these not norms? Sure they are. And they're qualitatively different, because I'm doing something that, you know, if this wasn't this transparent, you wouldn't really know what intricate games I can play with this. And I can do it on so many different levels. It's just, you know, beyond recognition. The fact what we're doing here, I mean, I'm basically talking to a certain object right now. I'm doing that. But in a certain sense, I'm talking with all of you. So this is, you know, the technology opened up new realms and new ways of establishing common norms that we can converse in ways that are just incomprehensible, basically, if you don't have this type of recursivity and basically establishing, being able to use something that it's really difficult to imagine what it even is on the most fundamental level, because what the heck is the most fundamental level of a cell phone, right? But things become so transparent, like, and this is so natural to you that you don't even notice it. You immediately slip into new realms of meaning and into new domains of symbols that acquire a certain reality that is even thicker and more present than the material reality of the vehicle that allows you to enter into these domains of significance and meaning. So it's basically quite simple in a certain way. And then what happens? You basically don't really necessarily have to take care of food that much. You don't really necessarily have to shelter yourself from this. And then you start, you know, opening up different questions, like the one that Adnan would surely be happy about. Am I truly a man? Am I truly a woman? Am I maybe a cat? You know, I'm just, you know, making a point. You can open up all kinds of questions that really take you into like really different, you know, fields and different spheres that would seem incomprehensible maybe 50 years ago, you know, and it's happening constantly.
Basically, what I'm saying is that all of this, this is the consequences. Like, this is what happened because at a certain point, the human ancestor found itself facing some kind of, I don't know, a challenge. Maybe it was a kind of a genetic mutation where it had to establish a new kind of normativity, a new norm. And a result of this establishment of the new norm and the new normativity is what is technology. Technology is the consequences of what happened in the normativity of humans as living beings.
No, I would say that they are basically the integral part that enable this new normativity to basically occur. It's the same. I would here side with Canguilhem, who basically says that it is wrong to think of the relationship between science and technology, where science provides theories and then technology is simply the application of a theory. It is in and through technology that new theories emerge. Often what happens is you basically tinker around with certain something and new possibilities open up and you need to conceptualize them and you kind of come be after that. And I would say that the same is true for technology. It's not like the new realm of normativity popped up and then technology evolved. No, it was in and through the development of technology that this normativity developed. This is the way you should think about it. It's a processual way. It's not something happened in me and then I was able to use tools. No, it was something that developed at a certain point, and once the click was made, the new realm of this was opening up. And it probably didn't happen like immediately, you know, it was just something that had several moves in a certain sense. I would say that the introduction of language added another huge jump. So first it was just, you know, the technology in the sense of material tools, but then a specific type of technology, which is language. And this is just...
What do you mean with introduction of language?
Introduction of language, I meant simply the emergence of language, not introduction as if here is a language, but introduction, the language, introduction, the entry of language into human existence.
Which is whole another big topic that we know nothing about.
No, but I think I understand Primož now, because you were talking about now that, of course, technique is nothing, it's processual, so it's a process of establishing knowledge by technical means, so it doesn't happen all of a sudden. But then when you talk about the qualitative difference, it happens all of a sudden. So, okay.
I mean, I think you see what many of these thinkers in this tradition, like I said before, is that there's this spot which remains unreflected. And I think it frustrated us with Goldstein when he was talking about the sphere of immediacy and stuff like that, but he wasn't really addressing the, I don't know, the abyss in the middle, which sort of led to this to the need for this fear of immediacy. And this is a similar problem I have with all this. Yeah, sure, tools, but what enabled the tools to develop in that way? But anyway, we've already gone off topic, so.
I don't think this was off topic. This was quite on topic, because these are the topics that Canguilhem addresses, but not in some of these. It was an extension, a meaningful extension, I would say. But okay, maybe if we revert a few step backs, and then if anybody has any other topics that he or she would like to bring up with regards to the Canguilhem text.
I mean, I have one topic which we've already we've quoted this before, but when he says to be sick means that a man really lives another life, and I'm really curious about this. What do you think about this? What does it mean that you live another life? Do you really live a completely different life, or is this a bit of a hyperbole on Canguilhem's part?
Yeah, I do think that you live another life, and I don't know if. Probably the best articulation of this, without actually providing like a theory of it, is simply to read the Death of Ivan Ilyich. Yeah, I think we'll all go slowly. The Death of Ivan Ilyich, because this is precisely where you have this description of a man dying, and basically the chasm that opens up between him and others. So the impossibility to convey of what's actually happening to him to others who are just kind of unable to enter into this world of the dying man. They either revert to these jokes, or they kind of try to say something, but they know it's really off, it doesn't really work, so they all become awkward around him. And there's only one person that really gets him and is able to enter into his world, and that's, I think, that this simple guy who's taking care of him like a servant or something like that, someone like that, who's massaging his feet or something, you know, a very simple-minded guy, a very devout person. Adnan, something's off.
No, I was just trying to remember that character.
Yeah, it was the guy that was massaging his feet and rubbing his, I think, that back or something like that. And then the best description ever is probably, you know, when there's this get together after he dies, and then people come over, and it's just so awkward. People just do all kind of the dissociation of, you know, death, and how normal people can really have difficulties relating to it. And another really good book on this topic is the Absent Body by Lider, where he basically talks from a phenomenological perspective how your experience of your body, your corporeal existence, changes, in the sense of that when you're healthy, your body is usually transparent. It is not really substantial. When you get sick, this is when you actually start feeling your body, where your body starts appearing. So I would say that your mode of existence changes profoundly. You actually do live another life, in my opinion. And you also know this with regards to yourself, that there is a discrepancy between what you've lived up till then and then what happened. And you usually try to convey this to others, and often you just come across as being this annoying little someone who's complaining about stuff. But what you're trying to convey is not necessarily that your shoulder aches, but that in the past this was not the case, and you could maybe, you know, push press 30 kilos more than you could, or something like that. People don't really get what you're kind of conveying there. It's the whole mode of being.
Maybe even if you recover to the fullest extent, you can still remain afraid of it repeating, and that by itself changes the way you make decisions. So yeah.
Maybe rather than calling this like another life, as opposed to first life you have, maybe just this illness, it's kind of nice shift you experience that enables you to value the life you have in these special conditions. So then you like notice the change, you know, rather than being two sorts of life, one sick, one healthy.
Maybe.
I mean, normal and pathological, right?
Normal and pathological. Okay, people are slowly going. So is it okay if we go? Everybody is okay with that? We haven't, yeah?
And I only, Sebastjan, Primož, Adnan, what was the talk in the beginning, the problem with streaming?
Yeah, I have to somehow
Permissions, yeah.
give certain permissions to Primož, and I'm not sure how I can do this. I don't think I can do this on this account.
Maybe only you can stream as a host.
Maybe, yeah. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
a problem.
No,
it's
but then
possible.
just Primož will sign in with, I mean, anybody, I mean, we'll just make some account that will be the host account or something.
Okay, we'll figure something out. Maybe Primož, you can really sign in and then change the name. And I can sign in from my other Gmail account, normal one. This is the faculty one.
Yeah,
But
okay. Yeah.
would the streaming the thing over Zoom save thing, and would the YouTube wouldn't be necessary?
I mean, you can stream to YouTube via Zoom.
From Zoom?
Yeah, yeah, and to Facebook,
Okay,
and to
yeah.
everywhere you want.
Yeah, I think Zoom is changing like on daily basis. It's hot stuff now, and
it's no problem. We just have to sort out the permissions somehow.
Okay.
I'll send you the link, Sebastjan. Maybe you read up, and if you maybe you find the permissions in the menus.
Okay, cool. See you in 2 weeks, I guess. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for staying so long. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.